All right, yesterday we talked about graphing inverses. Today we're going to solve for an inverse. So we're going to take a equation or a function, and then we're going to find or rewrite it as the inverse. So here's our steps. Our first step is we're going to replace any f of x or g of x or whatever it is with just a y, because it's kind of easier to work with if it's just a single variable. Then we'll switch our x and our y, because we talked about that yesterday, how the inverse is just when we flip our x and y values. So we'll switch our x and our y. Then we'll solve for y, and then we'll replace our y with whatever we started with. So like if we started with an f, we'll go back to an f, and then we'll put our little inverse sign that we talked about yesterday. Sometimes it'll also ask you, is the inverse a function? So you'll have to think about the graph and then use that vertical line test, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so our first example, we have f of x equals 5x minus 2. It wants us to find the inverse, and is the inverse a function? So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this f of x as just a y. So I'm going to have y equals 5x minus 2. Now, when we do the inverse, we know that the inverse is when we flip our x and our y values. So we're going to change our x and our y. So we're just going to flip the spots of where they're at. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and solve for y. So we're going to add 2 to both sides. So we have x plus 2 equals 5y. Now we're going to divide both sides by 5. Okay. So remember, that's a 1x, so I have to divide both of these by 5. So I'm going to have 1/5 x plus 2/5 equal y. Okay. Now, we didn't start with y, we started with f of x. So we need to go back and switch our y as a f inverse of x. Okay? And then equals, which was just 1/5 x plus 2/5. Okay? Now remember, we can also write this as just 1x plus 2 all over 5. I would accept either one of those as the inverse. Okay. Now the next part is the inverse a function. We have to kind of think about what shape this would be. Since it's just an x, there's no square root, there's no squared or anything like that. We know that it's going to make a line, right? Our y-intercept would be 2/5, our slope would be 1/5. So it just make a line. Now remember, our vertical line test is just, it passes the vertical line test if it only crosses the line once with any vertical line. So this line is never going to cross more than once, so it would be a function. So I'm going to go ahead and put yes. So when we try to decide that, we just think about what graph it would make, and then we think about our vertical line test. All right, let's look at the next example. All right, so this one is g of x equals 2/3 x plus 3, so we're going to go ahead and rewrite this as a y. So y equals 2/3 x plus 3. Now we're going to go ahead and swap out my x and my y, so we'll switch spots. So I'm going to have x equals 2/3 y plus 3. Now we're going to solve for y, so I'll subtract 3 from both sides. So I have x minus 3 equals 2/3 y. So we need to get rid of this 2/3, so I can either, I'm going to go ahead and just multiply both sides by 3 first. Okay, so I have 3x minus 9, since you've got to distribute that, equals 2y. Now I'm going to divide everything by 2. So I have 3/2 x minus 9/2 equals y. Okay, and we just talked about it. You could write it as 3x minus 9 over 2. I'd accept that as well. And then now we have to make sure we didn't start with a y, so we need to put this as a g inverse of x. Since we did the inverse, we have to rewrite it of what we started with. All right, and our next part is just to tell is it a function or not. The inverse, well, if I look, this is just going to make a line since it's just an x. There's no square root or anything like that, so we know it's going to make a line, so it's going to pass the vertical line test. All right, so let's take a look at this one. So it's a little different. It has a square root in it, but we're going to do the same steps. We know that this h of x is just really a y. So we're going to sub that out with an x equals the square root of y minus 3. Okay, now I need to get rid of this square root, so I'm going to square both sides. So I have x squared equals y minus 3 now, since the square and the square root kind of cancel. Now we just solve for y, so we add 3 to both sides. So our answer is x squared plus 3 equals y. Now remember, we didn't start with y, we started with h of x, so I'm going to go ahead and put h of x, but put my inverse sign since I did the inverse, equals x squared plus 3. Now let's think about this. This x squared tells me that it would make that parabola shape, okay? So we know it's going to kind of make this parabola shape. Well, if I think about that, a parabola, that's going to pass the vertical line test. It's always only going to cross the shape once. So this would be a yes. All right, let's go ahead and do this last one. So remember, this is just kind of like a y, so we're going to switch our x and our y. So I'm going to have x equals the square root of y minus 2 over 3. So I need to get rid of that square root, so I'm going to square both sides. So I have x squared equals y minus 2 over 3. Hey, I can't do anything with that 2 yet, so I need to times both sides by 3. So I have 3x squared equals y minus 2. Add 2 to both sides, so we have 3x squared plus 2 equals y. But we didn't start with y, we started with f, so we need to rewrite this as f inverse of x equals 3x squared plus 2. Hey, once again, I see that this is just an x squared, so I know if I graphed it, it would really just shift up 2 and then times our table by 3, but it still make that U shape. So we know that that U shape would always pass the vertical line test, so we're going to go ahead and say that this is a function.